It was a gray and damp morning in New York City. The streets, always chaotic, felt particularly grim, with the sound of taxis echoing between the buildings and the hurried footsteps of people trying to escape the cold. In front of a bakery in Brooklyn, where the aroma of freshly baked croissants and bagels mingled with the steam of hot coffee, a golden dog appeared out of nowhere. He looked out of place, a patch of sadness amidst the urban rush. His thin body trembled, and his matted, dirty golden fur seemed to tell a story of days spent in abandonment. But what stood out the most were his eyes, large, brown eyes that weren't just asking for food but pleading for something deeper. He didn't bark or lunge. He just sat there, motionless, with a painful dignity, watching the customers come and go as if each one might be his last hope. Inside, Maria, the bakery owner, noticed the dog for the first time while arranging a tray of muffins. Her heart skipped a beat. She had seen many stray dogs wandering the streets of New York, but there was something different about this one. He seemed on the brink of despair yet still clung to a gentle demeanor. From time to time, he lifted a hesitant paw, as if wanting to knock on the door, but he never did. It was as if he were waiting for permission that never came. The scene began to catch the attention of the customers. An elderly woman stopped, murmuring something about how the dog reminded her of the golden retriever she had lost years ago. A young man threw his bagel in the trash and looked at the animal with guilt. But no one did anything. Life in New York moved on relentlessly, swallowing stories like that without a second thought. As the day began to fade into evening, Maria stepped outside to throw some leftover bread into the trash. The dog, still there, slowly got up. He didn't run, didn't pounce. He simply approached very slowly until his paw touched Maria's hand. She froze, feeling the cold, damp touch. For a moment, it felt as if all the noise of the city had disappeared. It was just her and that gaze. And that's when she realized this dog wasn't just lost. He was waiting for someone, for something, for one last chance. Maria stood there, frozen, feeling the dog's paw in her hand like a silent plea that seemed to pierce her soul. The deafening noise of the city, honking, footsteps, voices disappeared for a moment. There was an unexplainable connection between them, something she couldn't understand. When she looked into those brown eyes filled with sorrow, she felt a familiar pain, as if the scene awakened memories she had buried years ago. "You're lost, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice slightly faltering. The dog tilted his head as if he understood. He didn't try to pull away from her hand or demand anything more. He just stayed there, waiting. It was this silence that impressed her most. The quiet of this animal. He wasn't begging, just existing, with a dignity that seemed too fragile for the brutal world of New York streets. Maria knelt down, ignoring the cold of the concrete seeping through her pants. She ran her hand through the tangled fur and felt the bones beneath the thin skin. He was weak, that much was obvious. Yet something in him seemed to fight, a strength that went beyond the physical. It was as if the dog was determined not to give up, even when everything suggested he should. Inside the bakery, customers peeked through the window, some with curious expressions, others with looks of disdain or indifference. "You can't bring a mutt like that inside," said a man as he passed, carrying a bag full of bread. Maria ignored him. Something inside her told her this encounter wasn't a coincidence. She stood up, took a deep breath, and opened the bakery door. "Come on, boy," she said firmly. The dog hesitated, looking at her as if he couldn't believe the offer. Then, slowly, he took the first step, crossing the threshold between the cold world and the promise of warmth. Once inside, he shook his body lightly, scattering small drops of water across the wooden floor. Maria grabbed a cloth, cleaned the floor, and looked at the animal, who was now lying in the corner, exhausted but finally safe. As she arranged a bowl of water and some pieces of bread, she couldn't help but think about how this moment felt different from anything she had ever experienced. The dog wasn't just an intruder or a problem to solve. He seemed to carry a secret, something Maria couldn't quite understand yet, but was about to discover, something that would change her life forever. The next morning, the bakery was busier than usual. The news of the bakery dog had spread throughout the neighborhood, and now customers were arriving not just for their bagels and coffee, but also to see the new visitor. The dog, lying in a corner near the counter, watched everything with his calm, attentive eyes, but didn't move much. Still, his presence seemed to have a strange effect on the atmosphere of the place. Maria, while taking orders, couldn't stop stealing glances at him. Since the dog had walked through the door, something inside her kept stirring. She didn't know what it was. Guilt, maybe? Old memories that insisted on resurfacing, even though she tried to suppress them? While preparing a cappuccino for a customer, she remembered her childhood in Queens, of a golden retriever very similar to this one, named Max, and how she had lost him. "Are you going to keep him, Maria?" a familiar voice asked. It was Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer, carrying her bag of bread. "A dog like that won't survive long on the streets." Maria hesitated. "I don't know yet. He showed up out of nowhere yesterday, and I'm not sure if he's really a street dog. Maybe he ran away from someone." Mrs. Henderson leaned down and looked at the animal. "Whoever let him go doesn't deserve to have him back. Look at him. It's like he's waiting for something. Or someone." Maria knew the words were true, but there was something more in that dog that she still couldn't understand. Something deeper than hunger or abandonment. It was almost as if he carried a story that no one could hear, because he had no voice to tell it. Later, when the bakery was empty, Maria sat beside him on the floor. With a hesitant gesture, she ran her hand through his still matted fur. He lifted his head and looked directly at her, so intensely that Maria felt a lump in her throat. It was as if he was trying to say something, maybe a plea or a silent confession. The feeling was so strong that she found herself speaking without thinking. "What happened to you, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" That night, Maria decided to take the dog home. It wasn't something she had planned to do, but she couldn't leave him at the bakery. There was a biting cold outside, and she knew the animal wouldn't survive another night on the streets. As they walked along the sidewalks lit by yellow streetlights, with the sounds of taxis and voices echoing in the distance, Maria noticed something curious. The dog walked by her side with the posture of a loyal companion, not pulling or hesitating, as if he were used to following someone. When they reached the small apartment she rented on the second floor of an old building, Maria opened the door and turned on the lights. The dog entered slowly, calmly surveying the surroundings. He seemed at ease, as though he had been there before. Maria frowned, feeling a chill run down her spine, but quickly pushed the thought aside. She grabbed a towel, warm water, and began to clean the dog, being careful not to hurt him. As she scrubbed the dirty fur, she noticed something unexpected. There was a mark on the dog's neck, a thin but noticeable scar, as if he had worn a collar that was too tight for too long. Maria stopped for a moment, her fingers gently touching the mark. "You belong to someone, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog looked at her, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he understood everything. Maria felt a strange weight in her chest, as if this animal were a puzzle whose last piece was still missing. Later, as she settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, the dog lay down near her feet, breathing slowly. The stillness of the moment brought unwanted memories to the surface. Maria remembered Max, her childhood golden retriever. He had been her best friend, a safe harbor during the toughest times of her life, until one day her father, in the height of a fit of rage, decided they no longer needed a burden and gave him to a shelter. Maria never knew what happened to him after that. "It can't be," she murmured as she looked at the sleeping golden dog. The thought was absurd, but there was something about him that made her feel like she was looking at a ghost from the past. She shook her head, laughing at herself. "You're going crazy, Maria." However, that night, as she tried to sleep, she heard a soft sound coming from the living room. She got up slowly, her steps hesitant, and found the dog sitting by the window, staring out at the street lit by the lampposts. He was still, but seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. And in that moment, Maria realized that maybe it wasn't her saving the dog. Maybe it was him who had come back to save her. The next morning, Maria woke up to the sound of soft scratching at the living room door. The golden dog was there, sitting and looking at her with attentive, patient eyes. He seemed eager to go outside, but not in a frantic way. It was as if he had a purpose. "Do you want to go outside?" Maria asked, still sleepy. The dog tilted his head, and she felt the answer was clear. She put on a coat, attached an improvised leash to the dog, and went downstairs. Once they reached the street, the dog started walking in a specific direction without hesitation. Maria followed him, intrigued. He seemed to know the way, ignoring the loud sounds of cars and the rushing crowds. The path didn't make sense to Maria. It was a mix of busy corners and quiet alleys. She tried speaking to the dog, but he didn't look away or slow down. Each step seemed to lead to a destination she couldn't predict. After nearly half an hour of walking, they reached a small, deserted park tucked between two tall buildings. The dog stopped near an old, weathered wooden bench. He sat there, staring intently at a tall, twisted tree nearby. Maria felt a chill. "Why here?" she murmured, trying to understand what it meant. While she was observing the area, something started to feel strangely familiar. The tree, the bench, it was like an echo of an old memory. Then it hit her. This was the park where she used to bring Max when she was a child. The same place where she spent hours playing with him, escaping the shouting and arguments at home. Her chest tightened. Have you been here before?" she asked the dog, her voice trembling. He just stared at her, as if the answer was obvious. Not knowing what to do, Maria sat on the bench, her heart racing. The idea was absurd. The dog couldn't be Max. That was impossible. But the more she looked at him, the more she felt like she was facing something that defied logic. He wasn't just a lost stranger. There was something there, a connection she couldn't explain, but it seemed to run deep. Suddenly, an elderly woman approached, carrying a bag full of bread to feed the birds. She stopped and looked at the dog with an expression of recognition. "I've seen this dog before," she said softly. Maria quickly turned to her. "What do you mean? Where?" The woman hesitated, pointing at the dog. "A few years ago, he used to hang around a shelter over in Queens. But he disappeared. It was like he went looking for something or someone." The woman's words echoed in Maria's mind as she walked home with the dog by her side. Look for something or someone. The phrase seemed like a clue, but to a riddle she still couldn't solve. Throughout the entire walk, Maria tried to organize her thoughts, but more and more memories from her childhood resurfaced, blending with reality. She wondered if she was just projecting her guilt onto the dog, or if there was something deeper that she still couldn't understand. That night, as the dog slept on the living room rug, Maria decided to take action. She grabbed her laptop and began searching for information about the shelter the woman had mentioned. After several unsuccessful attempts, she found the name, Hope Haven Animal Shelter, a small shelter located in Queens, near the neighborhood where she grew up. Maria's heart raced. She hesitated for a moment before writing down the address and deciding she would visit the next day. The next morning, with the dog by her side, Maria took the subway to Queens. The ride was silent, but her mind was racing. When they arrived, the shelter looked as run down as she had imagined. A rusty fence, a small crooked gate, and a simple building with peeling paint. A middle-aged woman, with a gentle expression and simple clothes, came out to greet her. "Can I help you?" Maria quickly explained how she had found the dog and mentioned what the woman in the park had said. The caregiver, who introduced herself as Ellen, looked at the dog attentively and seemed to recognize him immediately. "Oh yes, I remember this boy. We used to call him Lucky. He showed up here a few years ago with an old collar and marks on his neck. He stayed with us for a while, but one day he disappeared. We never knew where he went." "Lucky," Maria murmured, kneeling beside the dog. He looked at her as if waiting for something. "Was he someone's?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ellen shook her head. "We never found the owner, but he was different. He always seemed to be waiting for someone. He never really connected with anyone here, even though he was so sweet." Maria felt a knot in her chest, as if a piece of a puzzle was about to fall into place. As Maria petted the dog, Ellen seemed to hesitate before continuing. There's something curious about him. When we found him, there was a small piece of metal stuck in his collar. It was a medallion, with a name engraved on it. Maria looked up, her heart pounding. What was the name? Ellen went to the building and returned with a small, aged envelope. Inside, she took out a silver medallion with letters worn down by time. Maria took the object with trembling hands and read what was engraved. Her breath caught for a moment. There it was, the name she never expected to see, Max. Maria stood frozen, her fingers gripping the small medallion as if it were a fragment of a dream. It was impossible. Couldn't be the same. Max. Years had passed, even decades. But as she looked at the dog by her side, that persistent feeling returned with full force. He was staring at her with his deep, serene eyes, as if he already knew what she had discovered. Are you sure he came with this medallion? Maria asked Ellen, trying to control her voice. The woman nodded, her gaze fixed on the medallion. Yes, he had it on his collar when he arrived. We kept it because it seemed important, but we never found anyone who could claim it. Ellen hesitated, noticing the change in Maria's expression. Do you know this name? Maria didn't know how to respond. A part of her wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but another, deeper part whispered that this was real. I had a dog named Max when I was a child, she began, her voice nearly faltering. He was a golden retriever too. My dad, he took him away one day. I never knew where. And now, this. She lifted the medallion, as if the object was both an answer and a question at the same time. Ellen looked at her sympathetically. I don't know how to explain this. Lucky, or Max, as you call him, showed up here years ago. We don't know where he came from, but he always seemed like he was looking for something, or someone. Maybe he found you. The words sounded absurd, yet they made sense in a way Maria couldn't explain. The dog, now lying beside her, seemed calm, as if he was relieved to finally be where he belonged. Maria felt a wave of emotion wash over her. It was as if all the weight of guilt and unanswered questions she had carried for years was being lifted in that moment. But how is this possible? She asked quietly, more to herself than to Ellen. There was no logical explanation. The time, the distance, the odds, all of it made the idea seem ridiculous. And yet, there he was, with the pendant that confirmed the name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. As Maria stroked the dog's golden fur, tears began to roll down her face. Max, or Lucky, as they called him now, came closer and rested his head on her lap. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt a sense of peace. It didn't matter if there was logic to this story. All that mattered was that, somehow, they were together again. The journey back home seemed longer than ever. Maria held the medallion in one hand, while the other stayed firmly on the makeshift leash of the dog. Max, she could no longer call him anything else, walked beside her with calm, yet determined steps, as if he knew they were heading to the place where he finally belonged. The medallion seemed heavier than it should in her palm, carrying all the memories of a childhood Maria thought she had buried. When they arrived at the apartment, Maria closed the door and sat on the floor, still holding the medallion. Max watched her, his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for her to speak. The room, usually warm and welcoming, felt suffocating with the weight of the revelation. How did you find your way back to me? Maria murmured, more to herself than to him. Years have passed. I didn't even know where you were. She vividly remembered the day Max was taken away. It was a hot summer day, and her father, impatient and irritated, had said that Max was a burden. Maria had begged, cried, but the words of a 10-year-old girl carried no weight against the cold determination of a man hardened by life. When she came home from school that day, the yard was empty, and Max never returned. I thought you were... She stopped, the word, dead, caught in her throat. But Max, lying at her feet, was living proof that something stronger than chance had conspired to bring them back together. Maria stroked his fur, now clean and softer, feeling a connection so intense that it seemed to transcend time. In the days that followed, Maria couldn't think about anything else. The story of Max, or Lucky, as he had been called at the shelter, spread throughout the neighborhood. Some customers from the bakery began leaving gifts, food, toys, and even a new bed for him. Despite this, Maria felt that something was still coming, as if Max's journey to her wasn't completely finished. One night, while going through old documents in a forgotten box in the closet, Maria found a photo. It was from her childhood with Max, at the same park where he had taken her weeks before. She gently touched the photo, tears welling up in her eyes. The dog in the photo was proof that Max had always been her safe harbor, even when the rest of her life seemed to be falling apart. She placed the photo next to the locket on the nightstand and walked into the living room. Max was lying on the rug, eyes closed, but his breathing was calm. Maria sat beside him, leaning against the wall. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you for coming back," she whispered. For the first time, she felt that, no matter what happened, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together, finally home. The next morning, Maria woke up to an unexpected sound. A soft knock at her apartment door. Max, ever vigilant, lifted his head and fixed his gaze on the entrance. When Maria opened the door, she found Ellen, the shelter caretaker, holding a small envelope. "Sorry for showing up unannounced, but I thought this might interest you," Ellen said, handing over the envelope with a serious look. Inside was an old shelter form with information about the day Max had arrived. Maria unfolded the paper carefully. The document was faded, but still legible. It contained details about Max's condition when he was found: thin, with marks on his neck and signs of malnutrition. The most intriguing part was the note of an incomplete address and a name, Mr. Howard. Ellen explained that the address had been found on an old collar Max had worn when he arrived. "We could never trace who that person was. Maybe you can find out more," Ellen said before saying goodbye. As soon as Maria closed the door, she felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The name and address seemed like important clues, but they also brought up memories of her father and the cruel decision that had marked her childhood. With Max lying at her feet, she opened her laptop and began her search. The research led to a street in Queens, but the address number was missing, making the exact location a mystery. Still, Maria decided she needed to go to the place. She got Max ready for the walk and called a taxi, feeling her heart race with every passing kilometer. When they reached the mentioned street, something familiar took over her. The old houses and neglected gardens seemed frozen in time. Maria and Max walked slowly, observing every detail, until they reached a small, rusty gate. There was a faded sign with the surname, Howard, nailed to the wooden fence, almost invisible under the fallen leaves. Maria shivered. She pushed the gate, which creaked loudly, and followed the path to a modest house with broken windows and peeling walls. Max stopped beside her, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he knew this was the place. Maria hesitated before knocking, but there was no answer. She peeked through the window and saw an abandoned interior, with dusty furniture and boxes scattered on the floor. Just as she was about to leave, an elderly neighbor appeared. "Are you looking for Mr. Howard?" he asked. Maria briefly explained her story, and the man nodded. "He moved away years ago. He was a lonely man, but he loved that dog. He always said the dog was waiting for someone important. I think he never had the courage to let him go completely." The neighbor's words left Maria deep in thought as she walked back home with Max by her side. There were so many loose pieces in the puzzle, but one thing was certain. Max had taken a long journey to find her. Perhaps Mr. Howard had only been a temporary guardian, caring for Max until the right moment to return him to where he truly belonged. Back at the apartment, Maria sat on the couch with Max by her side, the locket in one hand and the shelter record in the other. Her mind was filled with unanswered questions. Who was Mr. Howard, really? And how had Max survived and found his way back to her? The silence of the apartment seemed heavy with meanings she couldn't quite grasp. Max, on the other hand, appeared calm, as if he already had all the answers he needed. As Maria stroked Max's head, she noticed something she had previously overlooked. On the back of the locket was a nearly faded inscription. "It's never too late. The simple words carried an unexpected weight. She read the phrase repeatedly, feeling it was a message meant for both her and Max. Perhaps destiny was offering them a second chance, an opportunity to mend what had been lost in the past. Determined to close the circle, Maria decided to do something she had avoided for years: visit her old home in Queens. It was where she had grown up, but it was also where she had lost Max and so many other important things. With a heavy heart, she put the makeshift leash on Max and left, this time choosing not to call a cab. Walking there felt like the right way to confront the past. When they arrived at the house, Maria felt a knot in her stomach. The garden was neglected, and the rusted fence was falling apart. Even so, childhood memories flooded her mind, both the good ones and the painful ones. Max stopped beside her, quietly observing the house as if he, too, recognized the place. Maria took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A woman she didn't know opened it, explaining that she had bought the house years ago. Maria gave an awkward smile and asked about the family who had lived there before. The woman didn't know much, only mentioning that some old belongings had been left in the basement. "You're welcome to take a look if you'd like," she offered. Hesitant, Maria stepped inside, feeling the walls echo with voices from a time that now felt distant. In the basement, she found a small wooden box with her name hastily written on it. Inside were old photographs, childhood drawings, and a sealed envelope. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and found a letter written by her father. The words were filled with regret. He apologized for taking Max away from her and admitted he never should have done it. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I hope that one day Max finds his way back to you. He was always stronger than I ever was." Maria sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face. The letter confirmed what she had always known in her heart. Max had never stopped searching for her, and now they were finally together again. Looking at Max, who was sitting beside her, she smiled. "I think we're finally where we're meant to be, boy. Home."